All right, so welcome to the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. My name is Haley Halverson. I'm the Director of Communications here, and I'm so grateful that you took the time to join us, whether you're here in person or watching online, to learn about the growing crisis of child-on-child sexual exploitation in America and around the world. This is not an uplifting topic, but it is very important, and so I'm very grateful that you're here today. The National Center on Sexual Exploitation is a nonprofit that was founded in 1962, and it works to defend human dignity and to oppose all forms of sexual exploitation. Things like addressing the public health crisis of pornography, prostitution, sex trafficking, and child sexual exploitation. In order to do this, NCOSE, the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, works to educate the public, it works to change policies both in corporations and in the government, and it works to unite a movement against sexual exploitation through the Coalition to End Sexual Exploitation, which has a summit coming up this April, and I'll put a link to that in the comments of this video at the end. So today we're talking about child-on-child sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, and we're going to be looking at what is sexual abuse of children, who is doing this, and most importantly, I think, why. The realities of child sexual abuse is that child sexual abuse is not limited only to physical contact. Child sexual abuse can include anything from groping, fondling, any sort of penetration, even child sex trafficking. But it can also include things like exposing a child to pornography, having a graphic discussion with a child for purposes of sexual excitement, or having the child expose themselves either in person or online. So we see that this idea of child sexual abuse is very broad, and that will guide some of our discussion today as well. According to the Center of Disease Control, 1 in 4 women experience sexual abuse when they're minors, and 1 in 6 men experience sexual abuse when they're minors. There's a lot of debate about this prevalence of child sexual exploitation, and I don't know that any one number is correct, but I think at the end of the day, whether the number is 1 in 4, or 1 in 8, or 1 in 14, or 1 in 16, any number is too much. And so I think that we can agree that child sexual abuse is a problem, whether it's 1 in 4 or 1 in 400. The signs of child sexual abuse are very broad. Some studies say that 40% of children who are sexually abused don't even experience or show symptoms that someone could identify. But when they do show symptoms, that can include things like changes in their sleeping patterns, whether that's having nightmares, having trouble falling asleep, sleeping too much, not wanting to take off their clothes during an appropriate time, such as bathing or going to sleep. Signs could include things like changes in their eating patterns, regression, so maybe sometimes a child will start having nightmares again, will start wetting the bed, will start sucking their thumb or relying on a childhood toy again. And then emotions. There could be a wide variety of mood swings, distraction, moody, or irritability that comes along with that. And both younger children and older adolescents can have a lot of these same signs, although adolescents also have other signs such as self-harming, drug use, alcohol use, and more. So we have a general idea of what child sexual abuse is, how it might manifest itself, but who is doing this? We often hear the idea of stranger danger, but in reality, 93% of children who are sexually abused actually know their perpetrator, their abuser, whether that is a family member, a family friend, a teacher, a librarian. It's actually someone who's in the person's life. And so that's something that especially parents really need to be aware of. But adults are not the only people who are sexually abusing children. Here at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, we've been hearing a rising number of stories of children who are being sexually abused by other children. A lot of people will dismiss this kind of activity as experimenting or playing doctor, but when they do that, they're actually discarding the experiences and harm that all of these children are experiencing when they're being sexually abused by another child. One children's advocacy group said that it interviewed 70 child sex abuse victims in just 4 months, which was a record-breaking number for them, and that most of these had abuse that was perpetrated by other children. They said some of these cases were children as young as 3 years old being abused by other children as young as 10 years old. But what is the prevalence? Again, we come to this debate in statistics about how much of a problem is this. A 2009 study said that 50% of child sexual abuse is perpetuated by other children. A UK study said that about 65–66%. Other studies say closer to 1/3 of child sexual abuse is perpetuated by other children. But again, whether that is the actual percentage or even if it's far smaller, this is a serious problem. And the reason why sometimes these statistics are really difficult to track down is because child sexual abuse is extremely underreported. Many people who experience abuse as children do not disclose to adults or to law enforcement, and we can see why child-on-child sexual abuse would be even more difficult to address or to count, because often if a parent has 2 children and one of them has been sexually abusing the other one, they won't want to bring that child into law enforcement and have them prosecuted for it. So whatever the statistics are, it's likely that what we're seeing come through in law enforcement is actually only a fraction of the cases of child-on-child sexual abuse going on in America today. What do we know about these children that are abusing other children? One 2009 national survey analyzed data from over 13,000 cases where this happened, and they found that there was an escalation of sexual abuse around age 12, so that's often when some children will begin acting out in a harmful sexual way. And 97% of surveyed minors who sexually abused other minors were male, although again, we do know that girls are doing this as well. This same study also found that 51% of children abused only girls, 30% abused both boys and girls, 19% abused only boys. Sorry, that word ran off of our PowerPoint. And 75% of the victims were 10 years old or younger when the abuse began. The majority of children who are abusing other children knew their victims. 25% of the sample included young children who were actually related to their victims. So this again shows why maybe some of this isn't being reported, because a mother isn't going to bring in her son and her daughter, or her cousin, or her nephew and her daughter to the police. And it's important to always recognize that child-on-child sexual abuse is the crime with 2 victims. I'm purposefully, if you haven't noticed, in my language, not calling children who are abusing other children abusers or perpetrators or criminals. These children themselves are being harmed through their actions that they're imposing on other people, and likely have been harmed in the past as well, which we'll get into in a little bit. So, why is this happening? This is a really disturbing matter. It's certainly really depressing for me as I was doing research into it, and as I was reading over these prevalence studies of all of these children who are experiencing these harms, this is the question that kept ringing through my mind. Why is this happening? This seems like a new phenomenon. NGOs and politicians and law enforcement are just now starting to wake up to this fact. This hasn't been something that's been on the national dialogue for the past 10 years. So why is this a new thing that's coming to our attention? Some children who are sexually abused then go on to sexually abuse others. A 2012 longitudinal study examined over 2,000 records of children who had been sexually abused, and 5% of those children were later convicted of sexual offenses, compared to 0.6% of males in the general population. So we see obviously here that just because someone is abused as a child does not mean that they go on to abuse another person. 95% in this example did not go on to ever abuse another person, but past experiences of sexual abuse do play into the likelihood of a person going on to sexually abuse another person. And it's easy to see why. Someone who's been abused has experienced warped or harmed abilities to recognize consent, or they have understood that sexual harm is maybe normalized in their minds or even associated with excitement or adrenaline rushes. One woman wrote into the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, and she said, "I don't know how old my brother was when our cousin started molesting him. He must have been very young, around 5 years old. The boys were 7 or 8, and 5 or 6. She continued and said that he started his addiction to pornography when he was 10 years old. He began sexually groping me and abusing me at night. This was my brother, who was only a few years older than me, and I was an innocent age of only 4 years old." Here we see an immediate intersection between a young boy who himself was a victim of sexual abuse, who then was accelerated on by watching pornography and then acted out on his own young sister. So we see that past abuse is one reason. Another reason is hegemonic masculinity, which is essentially a form of masculinity or a trend where someone is considered a real man to the extent that they dominate or overpower women or other men. Some people refer to this as toxic masculinity. This is something that has been documented in a life history analysis of 2 young boys who experienced and perpetuated sexual abuse on other children, and they had extreme trends of hegemonic or toxic masculinity. But how does a 12-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 13-year-old boy have this level of toxic masculinity where they see women as something to be dominated or abused, where they see harming another person as the way to assert that they are a real man? That finds its way back to pornography. A child advocacy group from Alabama was talking about the increase in child-on-child sexual abuse cases, and they said that they had cases where the child had said to them, "I learned that from the internet." And we've had children that are basically describing an addiction to child pornography, and then they try it out on another child. Why would this be happening? Why would a child watching pornography potentially play into hegemonic masculinity, toxic masculinity, or even actions of sexually abusing another person? Well, the first thing that you need to realize is the link between pornography and the brain. A 2015 MRI study from Cambridge found that compulsive pornography use was linked to conditioning, novelty seeking, and habituation of sexual stimuli, which means that users need more extreme content over time in order to achieve the same level of arousal. This is very similar to what we see in drug addiction or alcohol addiction, where there's that escalating need. And sometimes with pornography, that need for escalation could lead to either increases in the extremity of the pornography they're watching, increases in the volume of the pornography that they're watching, or it could lead into acting out on the pornography that they've seen to experience it with a real live person. And this is disturbing when we realize that pornography is teaching sexual violence and that sexually degrading a woman is what makes you a real man. And this is something that we've seen in one study which looked at popular pornographic videos of the time and found that 88% of the scenes contained violence against women, and in 95% of those scenes, the women responded either neutrally or with pleasure, which means that pornography is literally teaching that women enjoy sexual abuse and sexual violence and sexual degradation. So these are the lessons that children who watch pornography are getting. They're not only having the impact on their brain that is escalating in need of novelty, extremity, or acting out, but they're also being normalized to the idea that sexual violence is what sex is. And because pornography teaches sexual violence, it's not surprising that we see adults using adult pornography in order to perpetuate child sexual abuse. Adults use adult pornography to groom children, to educate them in the mechanics of sex, to encourage them to reenact those behaviors, to excite the children, and to enter the children into those sexual activities. And these are things that have been documented by people like Dr. Sharon Cooper, who's a forensic psychology pediatrician. She's amazing. Her information is at the bottom of this screen, and she's documented this very well. So I would recommend going to her for further input on that. But even when there isn't an adult that is using pornography in order to sexually abuse, in the absence of that adult, we see that pornography itself becomes a predator. By encouraging sexual violence, teaching children that sex is sexual violence, and then escalating that into action for some of those children. One 2011 longitudinal study of over 1,500 households found that minors who were intentionally watching violent pornography had an six-fold increase in the odds of self-reporting that they were likely to sexually abuse other children, for both boys and girls. So here we have children saying that the ones who are going out and intentionally watching violent pornography are more likely to self-report sexually abusive behavior. Another person wrote into the National Center on Sexual Exploitation and said, "When I was young, about 4 years old, my oldest brother started molesting me. He was a child himself at 8. We were often left alone while both parents worked, and he became curious. I was too little to know anything." She continued, "As we grew, he continued. My other older brother joined in too at times. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night with their hands touching me. After age 11, there was a brief respite when she began fighting back. However, a few years later, she would walk in on them watching pornography repeatedly, and after having seen this influence of pornography in their lives for a short time, she began waking up to them touching her again." So again, we see pornography impacting and escalating the rate of child sexual abuse. So what can we do? This is a really heartbreaking topic and something that I honestly never enjoy doing research on, but there are a lot of things that we can do. Policymakers and law enforcement need to systematically gather evidence about the presence of pornography in child sex abuse cases, and they need to do more research on child sexual abuse in general. As I've said, this is a phenomenon that's only now starting to get more attention, and we need more experts to take an interest in this. Also, policymakers and educators need to include information about the harms of pornography in digital citizenship or media literacy courses for children. There is one study that did a series of interviews with children who'd gone through treatment after sexually abusing other children, and they asked them, "What do you think could have been done that would have prevented you from going on to sexually abuse another child?" And these children gave 3 answers. The first one was they wished that they had had better sexual education starting before puberty and involving consent. One person wrote and said, "I think if I had sex education before everything had occurred, like obviously before I hit full-on puberty, I think everything would have changed. I'm not even sure if what would have happened, because I would have known it was wrong, more so than I did at the time. I would have known why it was wrong and why not to do it." And now preventing this by talking to children about sex and about consent, about my body is your body is your body, and nobody is allowed to touch you without your consent. Those kinds of messages can be given to children before puberty, and they can be given in the home. Whether or not our schools are going to do this, I think that every parent can intentionally teach their children these lessons in the home in a way that they're comfortable with regarding the child's age. And that can really help prevent some child sexual abuse. Another option that these individuals gave was better support and assistance for victims of childhood sexual abuse. One person wrote in and said that they had been sexually abused before they went on to sexually abuse another child. And they said, "Tell me before that it's not okay. The fact that I was never told that abuse was not okay really didn't help." And we think that children should get this. We think that they should know what consent is. We think that they should know that abuse isn't okay. But they're being taught by the pornography industry and by our mainstream media, such as in Game of Thrones or the Girlfriend Experience. Everywhere they're receiving messages that it's cool to push boundaries, that no means yes, that sexual violence is just part of what sex is. And so we need to actively teach them otherwise, because without hearing about this, then children are getting the default, which is that sexual abuse is just a part of life. Third, they asked for help in managing their exposure to pornography. One male wrote, "I didn't really watch pornography when my sister was around. Usually at that point, my head was thinking, let's try out what I've seen. Then, the pornography and that sense of power, they just pretty much added together and encouraged my harmful sexual behavior. Children are crying out to us, asking for help. Parents are not equipped to educate children about the harms of pornography after they've been exposed to it. Too many parents are saying that they only want to prevent their child being exposed, instead of also engaging with them to talk about it in healthy ways, to educate them about what to do after they've seen it. Things like look away, come tell a parent, and continue the conversation from there to talk about why what they've seen in pornography is not a depiction of real or healthy sexuality. In your community, there are many things that you can do. If you ever see or suspect child exploitation, you can call the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's Cyber Tip Line, which I have up there. You can also participate in the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's Poster Partner Program. The link is here at the bottom of the screen, where you can be emailed posters of children in your area who might be missing. You can also work to prevent children from being exposed to pornography in their public schools or in their private schools. Many people don't realize that our schools are filled with pornography, whether that's in the Wi-Fi or in online school library databases, which are academic educational resources that children are using in school. But even on first pages, those resources can have pornography in them. And you can learn more about that at safeschoolsafelibraries.com, which is a project by the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. And you can there download information about how to work to make sure that your schools are a pornography-free zone. And also in your home, you can talk to your child in ways that will help prevent child sexual abuse. For those of you here, I've included in your packet 4 conversations that you can have with your children to help prevent child sexual abuse, and I'll link that article into the comments of this video as well. You can also check out one resource called The Underwear Rule by a UK group. I can send the link to this if any of you are curious, which is a great resource for teachers and parents on how to talk in an age-appropriate way about what is appropriate or not appropriate touching. Also, Stop It Now is a group that has a great tip sheet on the signs of sexual abuse in children. So if you're looking to just be aware of your own child or children in your neighborhood, that's one place you can look for those tips as well. I think at the end of the day, child-on-child sexual abuse is an extremely disturbing problem, but it's something that we can do a lot more about. Whether that's individually talking with the children in our lives about consent and healthy body boundaries, whether as policymakers or law enforcement officials taking more steps to actively identify and interact with this phenomenon, or as educators as well. So I hope that we can all join together to share information about this, share the resources that we've provided with you, and we can fight to make this world a safer place for our children. Thank you. All right. If you guys have any questions, we can chat about that. We can also grab ice cream and just chat all together.